It was -12 outside, and the forecast said it was going to drop another 4 degrees by midnight. I remember checking my phone at exactly 7:23 inches the evening, debating whether I even wanted to drive to pick up groceries or just order in. I was still in my work clothes, still had my lanyard around my neck from the hospital, and I hadn't eaten since noon. That was when I heard the knock. It wasn't urgent. It wasn't the kind of knock that makes your heart jump. It was slow, soft, almost apologetic, like whoever was on the other side wasn't sure they had the right door. I set down my mug and walked over, looked through the peephole, and my stomach dropped straight through the floor. My grandmother was standing on my front step. She was wearing her good wool coat, the gray one she kept for church and Christmas dinner. She had a plastic grocery bag in each hand, the cheap kind that cuts into your fingers when it's heavy. Her hair was loose, which it never was. She always had it pinned back, and she was shaking, not trembling the way people do when they're cold for a few minutes. Shaking the way people shake when they've been cold for a long time. I threw open the door so fast I nearly pulled the handle off. She looked up at me with this expression I have never been able to forget. It wasn't fear, and it wasn't grief. It was embarrassment. She said, "I'm so sorry to bother you, sweetheart. I didn't know where else to go." I don't remember saying anything. I just pulled her inside. She was 81 years old. She had arthritis in both hands and a bad hip she'd been putting off surgery on for 2 years. And she had been standing on my porch in -12-degree weather, in November, in northern Ontario, with 2 grocery bags and her church coat. I got her sitting on the couch with a blanket and turned the kettle on and tried to ask her what happened in a voice that sounded calm, even though my hands were shaking. She took a few minutes. She kept apologizing. She kept saying she didn't want to cause trouble. And then, piece by piece, she told me. My aunt and uncle had driven her here. Not dropped her off at my door for a visit. Driven her here, put her bags on the step, told her that she would be staying with me now, and left. No phone call to me beforehand. No arrangement. No warning. They had driven away while she was still standing there trying to figure out where to knock. I sat there listening, and I felt something shift inside me that I can only describe as very cold and very quiet. Not the kind of cold that makes you panic. The kind that makes you start paying very close attention. I want to tell you about my grandmother, so you understand what this means. She raised 4 kids mostly on her own, after my grandfather passed in 1997. She worked as a school secretary for 22 years in the same building, knew every child's name, kept a dish of butterscotch candies on her desk until the day she retired. She still made her own bread every Sunday. She still called me on my birthday without needing to check the date. She was sharp and she was proud, and she had spent her entire life making sure the people around her were taken care of. My aunt and uncle had been living with her for the last 3 years. That had been the arrangement after my uncle lost his job. They would move into her house, help with expenses, keep her company. My grandmother had been relieved. She'd told me that. She didn't like being alone in that big house, and she trusted them completely. My uncle was her youngest son. She had always worried about him the most. I should have worried more about her. That first night, I made up the guest room, and I let her sleep, and I sat at my kitchen table until almost 2 in the morning, going back through every conversation I'd had with her in the last year. Every time she'd seemed a little quieter than usual. Every time I'd asked how things were at home, and she'd said fine, just fine, don't worry about me. Every time she'd changed the subject when I brought up money. In the morning, over toast and tea, she started talking. Once she started, I don't think she could have stopped if she'd tried. She told me that about 8 months ago, my uncle had sat her down and explained that he needed to help manage her finances because she was getting older and things were getting complicated. He had brought papers. He said it was just for convenience, just so he could help her with the bank and the bills, that it wouldn't change anything. She hadn't understood everything she was signing. She trusted him. She signed. What she had signed was a power of attorney. After that, things changed slowly enough that she didn't notice at first. Her bank card stopped working at the grocery store. My uncle said he had set up a new account for her, easier to manage. He would take care of everything. She stopped getting her mail directly. My uncle collected it and summarized it for her. She had been receiving CPP and OAS for years, a combined amount of just over $1,800 a month. She hadn't seen a bank statement in 7 months. She told me she had asked him once, in the fall, where her money was going. He had gotten upset. Not screaming, not threatening, just cold and dismissive, the way people get when they want you to feel stupid for asking. He told her that the bills were expensive, that the property taxes had gone up, that she should be grateful she wasn't in a home. She had not asked again. I kept my voice steady the whole time she was talking. I kept pouring tea. I kept my hands flat on the table so she wouldn't see them shaking. When she finished, I asked her if she had any of her documents. Anything at all. She reached into the pocket of that gray wool coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was a bank statement. A partial one, for an account I had never seen before, set up in both her name and my uncle's. The most recent entry showed a balance of $412. My grandmother had owned her house outright. No mortgage. It had been assessed at a little under $400,000 3 years ago. She had savings she had built over decades. She had a pension she had never touched beyond basic living expenses. And now, at 81 years old, she had $412 to her name, that she knew of. I folded that paper, and I put it in my own pocket, and I told her I was going to make some calls. I told her she was staying with me. I told her that the only thing she needed to do was rest. The first call I made was to the police non-emergency line. I want to be clear about that, because I have read the stories where people handle things themselves and let the family work it out privately, and I made a different choice. I called the police. I told them what my grandmother had told me. I told them about the power of attorney, the missing funds, the bank account. They took a report and they gave me a file number, and they told me to contact the Ontario Elder Abuse Helpline as well as a lawyer. The second call I made was to a lawyer. I had a colleague at the hospital whose husband practiced family and estate law, and I called her that morning, explained what was happening, and she gave me his direct number. I called him. He agreed to see me that week, and in the meantime, told me to document everything, keep the bank statement safe, and not to contact my aunt and uncle yet. The third call, I'll be honest, I almost didn't make. It was to my father. My father and my uncle had never been close. There had been a falling out years before, something about money at the time of my grandfather's passing, and they had settled into a careful politeness at family events that fooled no one. I wasn't sure whose side he would take. I wasn't sure he would believe me, but she was his mother too, and I thought he deserved to know. He was quiet for a long time after I told him. Then he asked if she was safe. I told him yes. He asked if I had called the police. I told him yes. He asked what he could do. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I wasn't handling this alone. My uncle called me the next morning. I had been expecting it. He was calm on the phone, almost friendly, which told me that he had already figured out what he wanted his version of events to be. He said that there had been a misunderstanding, that things at the house had been tense, that he and my grandmother had agreed that a change might be good for everyone. He said he had thought I would be happy to spend time with her. I let him talk. I did not tell him about the bank statement. I did not tell him about the lawyer or the police report. I said very little. I asked him once if he could send me an accounting of my grandmother's finances, just so I could help her manage things going forward. He said of course, absolutely. He would pull everything together. I have that phone call recorded. He never sent the accounting. The lawyer reviewed the bank statement and the details I had gathered and told me that what I was describing was financial elder abuse under Ontario law. He explained the process for challenging the power of attorney on the grounds that my grandmother had not had independent legal counsel and may not have fully understood what she was signing. He told me that we could apply to the court to have the POA revoked and a proper guardianship review conducted. He also referred the matter to the relevant authorities who would conduct their own investigation. My grandmother had a hard few weeks. She was safe and warm, and she ate well, and I was home. But I could see the grief sitting on her. She was not grieving the money, she was grieving her son. She kept saying things like, I don't understand what happened to him. He used to be such a good boy. I used to pick him up from school. I used to make his favorite soup on cold days. I don't know what I did wrong. I want you to understand that there is a particular kind of heartbreak in watching someone try to find a way to blame themselves for being betrayed by their own child. I had to be careful about how I responded. I didn't want to harden her. I also didn't want her to talk herself back into forgiving them before the legal process was complete. One evening, she asked me quietly if she was going to lose her house. I told her I didn't know yet. I told her we were doing everything we could. She nodded and looked out the window at the snow and said, "I just want to go home." I had to go into the bathroom and sit on the edge of the tub for a minute before I could answer her. My aunt called twice. The first time I didn't pick up. The second time I did, because I was curious. She told me that my grandmother was confused, that she had a habit of misremembering things, that they had been managing a very difficult situation for 3 years, and that nobody appreciated how hard it was. She said she hoped we could keep this in the family. I said I hoped so too. I did not mention that it was already considerably outside the family at that point. The investigation moved forward over the following weeks. The lawyer requested full banking records through the legal process. What came back was worse than I had imagined. In the period since the power of attorney had been signed, close to $95,000 had been moved out of my grandmother's accounts. Some of it was identifiable large transfers to my uncle's personal account, cash withdrawals, payments on a truck that was registered in my uncle's name. Some of it was less clear. Her TFSA had been partially liquidated. A GIC that had been set aside for over a decade had been cashed out. She had not known about any of it. There was one detail that I keep coming back to when I think about this whole thing. In her savings account, the one she had maintained for years, the one she had added to every month, even on a pension income, because she was careful and consistent, and she had always planned ahead. There was a withdrawal from the previous December, just before Christmas. $1,200. My uncle had taken $1,200 out of her account in December while she was buying his kids gifts, while she was making her Christmas bread, while she was wrapping presents with arthritic hands. I presented all of it. I sat in my lawyer's office, and I went through every line because I needed to understand it completely, needed to be able to explain it clearly when the time came. My father was there. He didn't say much during those meetings, but I noticed that he sat up very straight the whole time, which is what he does when he is trying not to show how angry he is. The court process for revoking a power of attorney is not fast. I want to be honest about that. There were weeks where I felt like nothing was moving, weeks where I was managing my grandmother's anxiety and my own, and trying to do my job at the hospital at the same time, weeks where I questioned every decision I had made about how to handle this. My uncle had gotten a lawyer of his own. He was contesting the revocation. He had put together a narrative that framed everything as responsible financial management, that my grandmother was declining cognitively and had required significant support, that the funds had been used appropriately for household expenses. My grandmother had a cognitive assessment done by a geriatric specialist. She scored well. She was sharp. She could recall dates and details and sequences of events. She told the assessor exactly what had happened, in order, without prompting. The assessor's written report described her as a reliable historian of her own circumstances. That report was filed with the court. The hearing was in March. It was cold and gray outside, and my grandmother wore her church coat again, the gray wool one. But this time, she had her hair pinned back. She sat in the gallery, and I sat beside her, and my father sat on her other side, and we waited. My uncle sat at the other table with his lawyer, and he didn't look at her once during the entire proceeding. Not once. She looked at him, though. I saw her do it. She looked at him the way you look at someone you're trying to find something familiar in. The judge reviewed the evidence, the cognitive assessment, the banking records, the testimony, the timeline of events. She asked pointed questions about the nature of the transactions. She asked about the independent legal advice my grandmother had or had not received before signing. My uncle's lawyer argued that the financial activity was consistent with managing shared household expenses. The judge did not appear persuaded. The power of attorney was revoked. A financial review was ordered to determine what restitution was owed. The matter was referred to the Crown for consideration of charges related to financial exploitation of a vulnerable person. My uncle was prohibited from managing any aspect of my grandmother's finances going forward and was ordered to vacate her property within 30 days. The drive home from the courthouse was very quiet. My grandmother sat in the back seat and looked out the window at the gray March sky and didn't say anything for a long time. Then she said, "Do you think he'll be okay?" I looked at her in the rearview mirror. 81 years old, coming from a hearing where her own son's financial exploitation of her had just been confirmed in open court, and she was asking if he would be okay. I said, "I don't know." She nodded. She said, "I kept thinking he would call. Not to apologize, just to check." He had not called. The house was hers again. Getting it livable again, and getting her affairs properly in order took time. She moved back in June. Once her finances were being properly managed through a formal arrangement that I was part of as a co-signatory, along with my father, the pension payments, the CPP and OAS, were redirected correctly. The remaining funds in her accounts were accounted for. The process of determining what might be recovered was ongoing. I want to tell you what happened the first Sunday she made bread back in her own kitchen, because I think that's the moment this whole thing became real for me in a different way. She called me in the morning and said, "Come for lunch, sweetheart." I drove over and walked into that house, and it smelled like it always had, like bread and the specific kind of quiet that old houses have in the morning. And she was at the counter in her housecoat and her slippers, and she had flour on her wrist, and she turned around when she heard me come in, and she looked like herself, actually like herself, in a way she hadn't, in months. She said, "Sit down, it's almost ready." I sat down. She put a plate in front of me and sat across from me, and we ate. And she told me about the neighbor's new dog that kept getting into her yard, and the snowdrops that had come up beside the fence, and whether she thought this summer she might finally look into having the back deck repaired. Small things. Ordinary things. The kind of things people talk about when they feel safe enough to think about ordinary life again. I watched her and I thought about the night she had stood on my porch with her grocery bags, and her church coat and her apology for bothering me, and I felt something loosen in my chest that I hadn't realized I was holding. I need to tell you one more thing, because I think it matters. Somewhere in the middle of all of this, during one of the harder weeks when the legal process felt endless and I was second-guessing myself, I called a friend from nursing school who had done some work in elder care advocacy. She asked me how I was doing. I told her honestly that I was tired, and that some days I felt guilty, like I had blown up my family, like maybe I should have handled it differently, more quietly, found a way to get the money back, without involving the courts. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said something I wrote down afterward and kept. She said, "You didn't blow up your family. Someone else did that. You just refused to pretend it hadn't happened." I think about that a lot. The charges against my uncle were filed in the fall. The process is still ongoing, and I won't speak to that in detail. My aunt has not reached out. My father sees his mother every few weeks now. He brings her groceries sometimes. He's not a man who talks a lot about feelings, but she called me after one of his visits and said he'd stayed for dinner and helped her with something in the garage, and then sat with her and watched the news the way they used to, when he was young, and she'd been happy about it, in a way that was quiet and complete. My grandmother is 82 now. She still makes bread on Sundays. She still has butterscotch candies in a dish by the door, which I think is a habit so deep in her that nothing could touch it. Last month, she started a low-impact exercise class at the community center on Tuesday mornings because her doctor suggested it, and she decided, in her words, that she might as well. She told me about it on the phone, and she sounded embarrassed and pleased at the same time. The way people sound when they are surprised by how much they are enjoying something. I think about the night she knocked on my door, the softness of it, the apology already built into it, and I think about how close I came to not being home that night. How close I came to having gone out to get those groceries. How long she might have stood there, in the cold, before she figured out what to do next. There are things I wish I had done sooner. I wish I had asked more questions during those years when something felt slightly off but never quite wrong enough to push on. I wish I had known more about the signs of financial abuse in older adults, about what a power of attorney really means and what it can be used to do, about what resources exist in this province for people who find themselves in that situation. I know more now. I tell people, when the subject comes up, I tell them to check in with their older family members, not just about how they are feeling, but about what they know about their own finances, whether they know what their accounts look like, whether they're making their own decisions, whether they have someone in their life who is only looking out for them. I don't think my uncle was always the person he became. I don't think people usually are. I think the combination of financial pressure and proximity and opportunity, and the particular kind of power that comes with being trusted by someone who loves you without conditions, I think that combination can do things to a person's reasoning that they might not have predicted. That doesn't make it acceptable. It doesn't change what happened or what needs to happen now. But I stopped needing to understand him as a monster, because the truth of what he is, and what he did, is more complicated than that. And also, somehow, worse. My grandmother forgave him. I don't know that she made a decision to do that as much as she simply could not sustain unforgiveness. It's not in her. She still mentions him sometimes, carefully, without bitterness, in the way you mention someone you used to know well. She prays for him. She told me so. She said she hopes things get better for him. I haven't forgiven him. I might get there eventually, but I don't think I need to in order to move forward. What I needed was to make sure she was safe, and she is. What I needed was to make sure the right things were on the record and in the hands of the right people, and they are. What I needed was to not look away from what was happening, because it was uncomfortable and complicated and family. The night she knocked on my door, she said she didn't know where else to go. I have thought about that sentence more times than I can count. I have thought about every person out there who is in a version of that situation, who is 81 and cold, and holding 2 grocery bags on somebody's porch, who doesn't know where else to go, and is not sure they should even be knocking. Who is afraid of causing trouble? Who is still trying, even then, to protect the people who hurt them? If you are reading this, and you are that person, please knock. It doesn't matter what time it is, or what the weather is doing, or how long it's been since you talked. Knock. And if you are reading this, and you have someone in your life who might be that person, call them. Not to ask how they're doing in the general way that lets them say fine. Call them and ask the real questions. Ask what their financial situation looks like. Ask if they know where their documents are. Ask if there's anything they've been meaning to tell someone but haven't gotten around to. Listen for the thing underneath the answer. My grandmother is 82, and she is making bread on Sundays and going to the community center on Tuesday mornings, and she has a dog next door that gets into her yard, and snowdrops coming up by the fence, and a daughter-in-law who should have come sooner, and a granddaughter who will not stop checking in. That is what a good ending looks like. The kind that is still in progress. I'll take it.